was to bear for several years of profit loss through capital intensity. And because of the Bantu education system and Mugabe's socialist free education, of course, they then exported Zimbabwean workers in who had the free English A-level education that was never available to anyone in South Africa, beginning a great deal of class conflict between the skilled Zimbabwean workers and the even more skilled South African workers who could remain in the capital-intense economy. Most workers can't get in there. Sampi-Terenblanche called for powerful tariff barriers to capital. As you know, that's a big no-no, so that we could establish in South Africa intense labor-related industries collectively owned by the workers as one way of solving the close to 50% unemployment problem. But I want to return to the original setting of my remarks. To quote Butler, whose lives are real? How might reality be remade? Those who are unreal have in a sense already suffered the violence of derealization. What then is the relation of violence to those lives considered unreal? In a profound sense, the lives of the boys have been derealized. Their lives do not count. They have ceased to matter. In the official story, they are reduced to the third force. A third force, I'm sorry I can't have this photo here, of 3 young black men, all 3 of them holding 2 knives in their hands. They have lost all individuation. And of course, for the boys themselves, since they were orphaned so young, they have no idea what their names are or where their ancestry is. As Sabu Zakoti, who is the current president of the Shanty Dwellers movement and at this moment is in hiding and his shack has been burnt, has passionately argued the systematic oppression of the majority of South Africans has been disappeared from the official political discourse of the country. And how can that suffering enter into the perceptual field, which is one way in which those who have been derealized demand redress for their suffering? Yes, and they must demand a different world, one, in fact, in which they can be seen. To quote Zakoti, how this appearance must itself be political. The only language that they, the leaders of the ANC, can understand is, guess what? Putting thousands of people into the street. Amandla, it works. It worked for us. It may work for you. This was a speech he gave to the Cape anti-eviction campaign, which Madota and I were present at. So comrades, today I appeal to you that what we need to do is conquer this capitalist system, because each second you turn your head, the capitalist system is there. We face electricity cutoffs, water disconnections, and so on because we cannot afford to pay. We are pushed below, way below, a livable life, and then our disappearance is mandated by the government as our shacks are destroyed. But we will make them see us. We will take back what is ours. We will develop an ethics of living communism and throw it in their face as a promise that they have betrayed. Zakoti, like other movement and shack dweller leaders, are fighting to envision a different world, a living communism, as well as what he calls abolitionism. But in keeping with my original setting, the struggle is also to make lives matter, so that the systematicity of violence against them, not only as a deprivation, but as police force, can indeed be seen and named as violence. Here we return to the original paradox. Could we be called by an ethic of violence to violent respond to defend the shanty dwellers in their demands to keep their land, and their land is being taken away from them because they're close to the ocean, and it was seen as a great place for an upper middle class development? I think the answer has to be yes, and Madota and I, who were spending time with the shanty dwellers, ended up in the streets fighting side by side with our comrades in the shanty dwellers because we felt that we had no other choice to do so. Who gets to call what violence? The shanty dwellers refused to move, and this was called violence by the ANC. The Ubuntu electricians, another group that is part of the Ubuntu project, are famous for smashing prepaid electrical meters and for turning on electricity for those who cannot pay, are designated dangerous criminals. And when you drive now from the airport preparing for the World Cup, you will see all sorts of signs saying those who turn on electricity and smash prepaid electrical meters are dangerous criminals. For those of you who don't know anything about Ubuntu, Ubuntu is an activist ethic of virtue in which the human is always performed in day-to-day acts with other people. It's neither a rule-bound nor a principle-bound ethic, but it's one in which we are always realizing our freedom collectively together, and this becomes a Bahá'ísm, which is the word for the people together acting politically. But are there actions too called for by Ubuntu, an ethic of nonviolence? I would say yes, but it does not involve the violation of the dignity of the other, crucial to the Ubuntu electricians' platforms. What we do in the name of dignity and respect, the very dignity and respect the ANC purports to stand behind. Instead, it is seen as exactly an answer to a call for respect. What is and what is not violent action then becomes a very complex question. But I now want to come closer to home to Michael Patrick McDonald's book on Southie, a very controversial working class area and poor working class area in Boston. I want to do so that vigils of grieving may be now seen as a necessary political and ethical meaning, bringing back the dead to the register of the human. These are on-the-ground rituals, and those that should be seen as such as an institution through a meta-narrative like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which does not necessarily mobilize those on the ground, but oftentimes imposes a meta-narrative now very well known, all forgiving black women who survive and continue. And those who break with that narrative, famously, like Mrs. Connealy, there's a wonderful book on that by Angie Krogh and two young COSA writers called There Was This Goat, simply get read out as insane because they do not follow that particular narrative of forgiveness. Her answer to the request by Tutu that she forgive the murderers of her son, who was part of the Gugulet 7, was the following. A complex analysis of the TRC is obviously beyond my remarks today, but I do want at least for us to think about the contrast between on-the-ground grieving rituals, which are mobilized by people, and those that are imposed from above with rules and legal restrictions at whose narrative can count and in what way and can count. But let me now return to Southie, which again was a kind of violence in the 70s that could not be read by the liberal press because it seemed simply like it was poor whites against poor blacks about busing. But in fact, again, it gets back to the very telling Isikosa question of who has the goods and who should have the goods and what is the distribution of those goods. And all too often, because of the segregation of communities from the very powers that they would fight, you end up expressing your agency against those who come into your territory as the only available way of expressing your agency. Note that many of the people at the time who were interviewed in Southie did not say they had any hostility towards the black children or were racist. But I leave you with MacDonald precisely because the day-to-day violence which took the lives of many of his siblings, and this is the book that I will be reading from, was seen as simply the way things are by the community, which was a further mandate of an imposed code of secrecy, very much borrowed from many years of Irish politics. A secrecy which actually protected the gangs that were killing the children of Southie. MacDonald lost 4 siblings, the kids, as his mother called them, only to refer to them because the loss of each individual child was way too painful to reach the register of consciousness. The kids were lost to drugs, to gang violence, to drugs-induced suicide, and ultimately to detention for an unwarranted charge of murder. 4 out of the 5 siblings were killed. Another has been rendered after a drug-induced stroke into a wheelchair for the rest of her life. MacDonald became involved in nonviolent politics, the vigil of safety, and more specifically, the buyback of guns. But it is the on-the-ground vigils of naming the dead that transform them into lives that matter, and thus the violence against them could appear in the perceptual field as violence. I will leave you with Michael McDonald's words, and this returns us, of course, to Judith Butler's question, can there be a politics of grieving associated with building a community in which those lives that have been brutally repressed below the human actually have a moment of transubstantiation and come back as dead as what should have mattered. Standing at the altar, these are McDonald's words, I at last felt I might be able to reconcile myself with all my memories of confusion, bloodshed, and betrayal, and that I could do it with love. I love my family. I love Salfi. These candles burn for my brothers. I stopped and I took a deep breath. Then I spoke up. Davy, Frankie, Kevin, and Patrick, and for all souls. And now in the words of a language whose very speaking was considered violence, A Hamaka Ulig, which is what was written by the hunger strikers as they approached their death, I will die for all souls. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next we will have Alan Feldman, Associate Professor of Media Studies at New York University and a cultural anthropologist who's conducted ethnographic research on the politicization of the gaze, the body, and the senses in Northern Ireland, South Africa, and the post-9/11 global war on terror. His research and teaching interests include visual culture and violence, the political anthropology of the human body, performance studies, state culture, and the archaeology of media and technology. Feldman's the author of the critically acclaimed Formations of Violence, which Drusilla Cornell's just mentioned, numerous essays on political violence as visual and performance culture, and the forthcoming book, Archives of the Insensible, War, Terror, and Violence as Dead Memory, Duke University next year. Alan Feldman.
My work in Northern Ireland, South Africa, and on the current war on terror, can you hear me? Has been an engagement with forms of life, communities, subjects, and silenced sovereignties, navigating, drowning, surviving, and dying within ecotones of informalized state violence. By informalized violence, I refer to decentered warfare prosecuted by paramilitarized and decriminalized parastate proxies and surrogates in procedural mufti and armed with built-in warrants of indemnification and deniability. I term this development the becoming non-state of the state, an apparatus of political virtualization and spectrality invested in the production of vicarious power rather than the practice of law-conserving violence, classification, or discipline. This is war by proxy in which the state manipulates and enacts its mastery over its own disappearance in the state of emergency. We are today embroiled in wars of naming and unnaming, including what can be named or not named as war and violence. Since my field work in Northern Ireland in the 80s and South Africa in the 90s, the depth and gauge of state-derived anomic violence has only intensified and globally expanded as a mode of ungovernable governmentality. This is ruled by voyeuristic power as the state becomes partable through transplanted and exorbited organs of aggression that are retrofitted for tasking everyday life with violence, intimidation, and terror. Today, the exemplary corporate body without organs is the state become non-state with its detachable prosthetic tendrils of force and violence. This counterfactual state is shaped by secrecy, programmatic indifference, and institutionally orchestrated inattention and misdirection, which can traverse anonymous disappearances, forgotten massacres, misplaced burial grounds of the executed, and the outsourced backspaces and black sites of torture. The state become non-state is a deactualization of the state that has nothing to do with a decrease in the pragmatic efficacy, has nothing to do with its decrease with a decrease in its pragmatic efficacy. Quite the contrary. It coincides in part with what Michel Foucault anticipated as a capillary deinstitutionalization of panoptical power, which he identified as aspiring to continuous command and control over everyday life. However, the contemporary securocratic state, term that was invented in South Africa, no longer requires a continuous biography or legal continuity as a correlate to continuous panoptical power over a body subjected to compulsory visibility. Compulsory and contingently constructed zones of invisibility, alternating with optical saturations of shock and awe, cutting out zones of sheer human exposability, are the order of the day. What unfolds between a war without measure and the war that refuses measurement? The subjects of extraordinary rendition and torture cannot be indicted, accused, or tried, as such steps would not only render them calculable, measuring their offenses and non-offenses, but also render their very detention and torture measurable and recallable by ethics and law, and thus calculate the limits and thresholds of the non-law that warehouses these figures. The American debate on the legality or illegality of torture occurs in the aftermath of torture's routinization on concrete bodies in anomic spaces. The rogue body of the political other becomes the surface of procedural discontinuity that traverses negotiability and the non-negotiability of torture. At issue here is not the measure of torture's lawfulness or criminality, but rather the institutionalizing of its legal indeterminacy. Here, militarized democracy practices self-mythification as that form of government which claims to come after violence and terror as all that which lacks limits. That Giselle Cornell has written extensively about. Democracy takes on the task of instituting a polis, a political community, a political self-limitation from a non-law anomia that is beyond given community and its thresholds. The political limitation of violence is not necessarily its suspension, but its symbolic instrumentalization as an exemplary medium, as a demonstration of democracy's political self-limitation. However, a self-instituting sovereignty over limits, by definition, cannot be contained by any nomothetic limit that repeats and conserves that mastery. Democracy can paradoxically inflict a supposedly limited humanitarian terror as the measure of its lack of limitation, such as regime change or compulsory democratization as unlimited regimen of limits. And I'm reminded of Derrida's poignant question when he asked, can we speak democratically about democracy? Today, democracy's proclaimed self-limitation of its violence secures a global deployment underwritten by advanced technocratic utilities, from smart bombs to drone planes to full-spectrum dominance. Democratic technicity as the fusion of ballistics and ethics becomes a legitimating metaphysics in which wars for democratization are the proportionate aggregation and distribution of the political good in the form of triggered ordnance, pattern bombing, and acquired targets. Distributed good as ballistic target acquisition transmutes into the ethical excess of unlimited suffering that is excused in the utilitarian and equalizing terms, as collateral damage. The death and harm that is morally relativized and homogenized within the means-end relation by the militarized good of all. Political theory thus needs to develop an anti-subjectivist and anti-formalist theory of sovereignty, and this is a critique of Agamben, and we can talk about that later on. An anti-formalist theory of sovereignty to the degree that the existing model of sovereignty is predicated on inadequate theories of the political subject and split between nomothetic and anomic power. An anti-subjectivist theory of sovereignty theorizes the state form as irreducibly manifold and heterogeneous, no longer denoting sovereignty as numerically one, as a synthetic ipseity or unity identical with itself. The emergent anarchic securocratic state is incapable of instructing us about the legitimacy and the illegitimacy of its norms.
Thank you very much. Next, we'll have Mary Louise Pratt, a Silver Professor of Spanish and Portuguese Languages and Literatures at NYU. Mary Louise Pratt has received numerous honors and awards, including the Guggenheim Fellowship, Pew Foundation Fellowships, and NEH grants. In 2003, she served as president of the Modern Languages Association. Mary Louise Pratt's expertise extends through Latin American literature and Latin American studies into comparative literature, linguistics, postcolonial studies, feminist and gender studies, etc. Her seminal publications within these disciplines include Imperial Eyes, Travel Writing and Transculturation, an explanation on the discursive formation of Latin America and Africa, as formulated by metropolitan writers. It has been called one of the most widely influential works of the last decade. Her other publications include the article Humanities for the Future, Reflections of the Stanford Western Culture Debate, and Arts of the Contact Zone. Her single-authored text Toward a Speech Act Theory of Literary Discourse established Mary Louise Pratt as a leader in the field of cultural criticism. Mary Louise Pratt.
Thank you. If you can't hear me, jump up and down back there. If you work on Latin America, you know that there's a field of study there called violentology, and there are specialists who are called violentólogos, particularly in Colombia, where the question of violence has become a kind of constructing principle of social theorization. I find violence very unsatisfying as an object of study, because we use the term all the time, intellectuals use it all the time, as if we knew and agreed on what it was, what it refers to. But in fact, the concept doesn't have it doesn't really have contours, I think, for us, and that's something perhaps we can discuss. It has scenarios like the ones we've been discussing. It has nodes, but I'm not sure what its contours are. It's an abstraction. It's very abstract. And at the same time, it's unsatisfying when we analyze violence in the concrete as a thing that is either present or absent, because that also is almost always feels inadequate, because violence is always potentially present. Another discomfort I have with the concept of violence as an object of study is that it's a pathologized object. And that, I think, limits us in a way in how we approach it. And I'm not a specialist in the study of violence, so I hope that my colleagues on the panel can correct this concern. But there's some way in which, as long as it's a pathologized idea, we don't really necessarily want to understand it, at least to the extent that we depathologize it, or at least to the extent that we become somebody who fully understands a field of massacred, dismembered bodies. Do we want to be that subject with that level of knowing? Do we want to think by means of our own capacities for violence to reach that point of understanding? It's interesting that we also don't necessarily ask specialists who are trained in violence about violence. We don't see them as a source of knowledge for us, and yet we ourselves are not usually, very few of us are trained in the use of violence. And in fact, our job is to be the police of civility. Mm-hmm. So there's some way in which academic discussions of violence get permeated by fear, our own fear, and that kind of freezes the intellect, our own horror, our own terror, and our own imaginations. And I think another thing that I point out about the study of violence is that very often when we talk about violence, the abstraction of violence displaces our discussion from more specific things like weaponry or cruelty. That there are ways in which sometimes it's possible to ground a discussion in things like the distribution, the commodification of weaponry, the promotion of weaponized conflict for profit, that is a way of discussing something that's perhaps more particularized than calling it violence. So those are just a few things that I wanted to point out. What I really want to talk about today specifically, however, is the question of language and violence. And if I could just find my piece of paper here, would help. Okay, doesn't matter. We often, in common sense, we speak of violence as a thing that violence and language are mutually exclusive in common sense. One begins where the other ends. When people stop talking, they start fighting. When they stop fighting, they start talking. So we see violence and words as violence and language as in complementary distribution. And we also think of violence often as that which is beyond language. Poets will often describe war as that which people will describe war as being beyond words. But one of the things I think that's interesting is that violence actually usually is accompanied by language. And that one of the reasons perhaps that language can't grasp violence is that it's usually embedded in it. When violence occurs, it usually relies on a discursive accompaniment to assign it its meaning. And that framing is what marks the social character of violence. So anthropologists will say that aggression is biological, violence is social. And very often it is the accompanying language that gives violence its social, assigns it its social meaning, gives it its social character. So even though violence might erupt when dialogue stops, language does not. Language is usually there as an accompaniment to violence. And this is also true, for example, it's also true in the case of torture. So Elaine Scarry's famous book, The Body in Pain, describes torture as the thing that, as being beyond language, as that which breaks past the possibility of language. But in fact, torture is almost always, again, accompanied by a verbal text that assigns it its meaning. So torture is accompanied by interrogation, and it works both ways. Interrogation can be a motive for torture, but and torture can be a motive for it can be an instrument of interrogation. But it's just as common, I believe, that interrogation is the alibi for or the pretext for cruelty. This in warfare, these contextualizing, meaning-assigning powers of language get weaponized. And I'm speaking here from an article that appeared this December in the PMLA called Harm's Way, Language and the Contemporary Arts of War, and it's something I've been thinking about for the last couple of years. In the weaponization of language, especially resides in contemporary warfare, in United States warfare, in what gets called psychological operations, which is a kind of warfare, a sector of warfare that has expanded and refined itself immeasurably in the last few decades. So every unit now, and you keep hearing this, every unit in Iraq and Afghanistan is accompanied by a psychological operations specialist. And psychological operations are defined, we don't have time to go into this in detail, but here's the definition the military gives. Psychological operations are planned operations to convey, this is the weaponization of language in warfare, planned operations to convey selected information and indicators to foreign audiences, to influence their emotions, motives, objective reasoning, and ultimately the behavior of foreign governments, organizations, groups, and individuals. The purpose of psychological operations is to induce or reinforce foreign attitudes and behavior favorable to the originator's objectives. That's the Joint Chiefs of Staff definition of psychological operations, and that can include anything from dropping leaflets from a plane to waterboarding. Now, but how, apart from language as something that accompanies violence, we can ask, well, how does language itself commit violence? How does it inflict harm or inflict injury, which is one of the core definitions we would use of violence. And it's interesting that in the United States, the power of language to inflict injury was actually encoded in a legal decision that some of you may have heard about that was made in 1944, and it's called the In all our debates about hate speech in the United States, this decision is cited all the time. It's the decision of Chaplinsky New Hampshire versus Chaplinsky, and it's called the fighting words doctrine. And in this decision, which was made in 1944, which in the midst of a scenario saturated with reference, with allusions to the war, the